A man drove himself to a small-town hospital believing he was just sore from a car accident. He walked into the building on his own 2 feet, filled out paperwork, and waited his turn. What the scans found a few minutes later would have ended most people's day very differently. His neck was broken in 2 places, and one of those fractures was sitting right on the edge of catastrophic. A single wrong turn of his head on that drive could have changed everything. That man is Ladd Drummond, husband of Food Network star Ree Drummond, and this is the real story behind the headlines that still circulate about his health today, years after the fact. To understand why a rancher would calmly drive himself to the hospital with a broken neck, you have to understand what kind of day he was actually having. On March 10, 2021, a wildfire broke out on the family's ranch in Osage County, Oklahoma, fueled by high winds that were gusting well past 30 miles an hour. On a working cattle operation of this size, a grass fire isn't a distant emergency you watch on the news. It's an immediate threat to grazing land, to fences, to herds of animals, and to the people who have to go meet it head-on. Ladd and his nephew Caleb, then 21 years old, each climbed into a separate fire truck and drove out toward the flames from different directions, doing exactly what ranch families in that part of the country have done for generations. The problem was visibility. Thick smoke mixed with dust kicked up by the wind and turned the gravel roads on the ranch into a near whiteout. Neither man could see the other coming. The 2 trucks met head-on, driver's side to driver's side, with enough force that Caleb was thrown roughly 70 feet from the vehicle. It was, by any measure, a violent and frightening crash, and in the chaotic minutes afterward, Ladd's first instinct wasn't to worry about himself. According to Ree's own account on her blog shortly after the accident, he insisted that emergency responders focus entirely on Caleb, who was clearly the more seriously hurt of the 2 and was rushed to St. John Medical Center in Tulsa in critical condition with head, arm, leg, and internal injuries. Once Caleb was in the ambulance, Ladd did something that a lot of cattlemen in that part of Oklahoma would recognize immediately, even if it makes the rest of us wince. He got into his own truck and drove himself to a hospital in Pawhuska, the small town near the ranch, assuming he was just stiff and bruised. Ree later wrote that this was partly because he wanted the paramedics focused on his nephew, and partly because, in her words, cowboys don't like to admit when they're hurt. It's a small detail, but it says a lot about the culture this family comes from, one where toughness isn't performative, it's just the default setting. It was only once doctors in Pawhuska ran imaging that the real severity of his condition became clear. Ladd had fractured his cervical spine in 2 separate places, and Ree later said that one of those fractures was, in her words, very close to being catastrophic. He was transferred to Ascension St. John Medical Center in Tulsa, where a neurosurgeon performed emergency surgery to stabilize his neck, using hardware to hold the fractured vertebrae in place while the rest of the injury healed on its own. This wasn't a minor procedure or a precaution. This was the kind of injury that, handled even slightly differently, could have resulted in permanent paralysis or worse. The fact that he walked himself into a hospital lobby with an injury like that is honestly hard to wrap your head around. There was also a ticking clock hanging over his recovery. His oldest daughter, Alex, was getting married on the ranch less than 2 months later, on May 1st. Doctors sent Ladd home with strict instructions to wear a rigid neck brace for several weeks so the second fracture could heal properly. And Ree has said publicly that she and her daughters joked about decorating the brace to match his tuxedo so he could still walk Alex down the aisle. He made it. By all accounts, Ladd was present for that wedding, brace and all, recovering on a timeline that let him be there for one of his family's biggest days. The recovery itself has been, by most descriptions from Ree over the following years, remarkably complete. Ladd has gone back to full ranch work. Lifting, riding horses, feeding cattle, running daily operations alongside his brother Tim. There are updates from Ree describing lingering stiffness in his neck, some limits on how quickly he can turn his head, but nothing that stopped him from returning to the physically demanding job he's done his whole life. On their wedding anniversary the following year, the couple even took a vacation to Colorado together, something Ree described as long overdue after the accident derailed several earlier attempts at the same trip. So if you've seen headlines online implying Ladd Drummond is in some kind of ongoing health crisis, it's worth being clear about the timeline. This happened in the spring of 2021, and by every public update since, he made it through and got back to work. What this whole episode does tell you, though, is something true about who Ladd Drummond actually is and what kind of operation he's responsible for. This isn't a hobby farm or a weekend property. It's one of the largest privately held ranches in the entire United States, and understanding the scale of it explains a lot about why a man with 2 broken vertebrae would rather get back to work than sit still. According to land ownership tracking from outlets like the Land Report, the Drummond family controls roughly 433,000 acres of land, concentrated mostly in Osage County, Oklahoma, with additional holdings stretching into southern Kansas. That figure puts the family around the 23rd largest private landowner in the entire country. To put that in terms that are easier to picture, 433,000 acres works out to somewhere around 675 square miles, an area larger than the city of Los Angeles and more than half the size of the entire state of Rhode Island. Within Osage County itself, the Drummonds reportedly control somewhere close to 9% of the county's total land, making them by far the largest private landholders in that region. Managing land at that scale isn't really comparable to running a family farm. The terrain out there is flint hills, limestone outcroppings, and rolling native tallgrass prairie that has looked more or less the same for a very long time. It's beautiful country, and it's also unforgiving. Checking a single fence line can turn into an all-day trip. Between the various properties tied to the family, reporting has put the operation's herd numbers in the thousands of cow-calf pairs as a baseline, with many thousands of additional stocker cattle brought in seasonally to fatten on the grass before moving further along the beef supply chain. Managing that many animals across that much ground takes a full-time crew, heavy equipment, rotational grazing plans to protect the grassland itself, and constant attention to water sources, especially during Oklahoma's brutal summers when a dry stock tank can become a real emergency fast. There's another layer to the ranch's income that a lot of people don't know about, and it connects the family's private land to a genuinely federal program. For years, Drummond Land and Cattle Company has held contracts with the U.S. Bureau of Land Management to provide long-term pasture for wild horses and burros that the government has removed from public lands out west. Public holding facilities for these animals are chronically over capacity, so agencies rely on private ranchers to give these herds room to live out something closer to a natural existence. Reporting on these contracts, including public records covered by outlets like the Daily Mail and Wide Open Country, has put the payments to the Drummonds at multiple millions of dollars over the years, a steady stream of income that isn't tied to the ups and downs of cattle prices the way the rest of the operation is. None of this land showed up out of nowhere, and the story of how the Drummonds got it is worth telling honestly, because it's more complicated than a simple bootstraps narrative. The family's roots in Oklahoma start with Frederick Drummond, a young Scottish immigrant who came to the United States in his early 20s after his father's death left him with limited options at home. He worked briefly as a ranch hand in Texas and as a clerk in a St. Louis dry goods house before arriving in Pawhuska in 1886, then part of Indian Territory and the capital of the Osage Nation. He took a job as a clerk for a trading company that served both the Osage people and early settlers, and by all accounts he was sharp, hardworking, and genuinely picked up the language and customs of the community he was doing business with. By the mid-1890s he'd bought into the company, and in 1903 he moved to Hominy, Oklahoma, and founded his own trading operation, the Hominy Trading Company, which grew into a sprawling general store that supplied nearly everything a rancher or farmer in the region might need. When Frederick died in 1913, his 3 sons, Roy Cecil, Fred Gentner, and Alfred Alexander, who went by Jack, took over. While Fred Gentner ran the mercantile side of things, Jack and Roy pushed the family hard into land acquisition and cattle ranching. This is the part of the story that connects to a much darker and more well-documented chapter of Oklahoma history. During the early 20th century, the Osage Nation was sitting on some of the richest oil deposits in the country, and headright payments made many Osage families extraordinarily wealthy almost overnight. That same era saw a wave of exploitation and violence against Osage people by white settlers and businessmen looking to get access to that wealth, a period documented extensively in the years since and brought to wide public attention through the film Killers of the Flower Moon. Reporting from outlets including Bloomberg has noted that the Drummond family's early land acquisition included leasing grassland from the Osage Nation and, in at least one case, purchasing a headright share from a man who had inherited it through marriage into an Osage family. It's a part of the family's history that sits alongside the hard work and grit narrative, and any honest telling of how a family ends up with 433,000 acres in this specific corner of Oklahoma has to include it. By the 1980s, descendants of Frederick Drummond had built the operation up to more than 200,000 acres across Oklahoma and southern Kansas, and it kept growing from there. The generation after that produced Charles Robert Drummond, known to television audiences simply as Papa Chuck, a deep-voiced, old-school cattleman who raised 3 sons of his own, Todd, Tim, and Ladd. The family experienced a genuine tragedy when the oldest son, Todd, was killed in a car accident as a teenager, a loss that reportedly bonded Tim and Ladd even closer as they grew up working alongside their father. Chuck ran the operation with a famously demanding work ethic well into his later years and passed away in his sleep in November of 2022, leaving Tim and Ladd as the stewards of the family's holdings. That's the version of Ladd Drummond that existed for most of his life before television ever entered the picture. A working cattleman in a family with deep, complicated roots in Osage County, managing an operation most people will never see the scale of. Everything changed, at least publicly, because of a chance encounter at a bar in Bartlesville sometime in the mid-1990s. Ree Drummond, then Ree Smith, grew up in Bartlesville as the daughter of an orthopedic surgeon, went off to the University of Southern California to study, and had every intention of moving to Chicago to pursue a law degree after a short visit home. According to the story she's told publicly many times over the years, she spotted Ladd at a bar during a holiday visit, struck up a conversation, and figured she'd hear from him the next day. She didn't hear from him for months. When he finally called, he took her to dinner, and within a couple of weeks he told her he loved her. Her plans to move to Chicago quietly disappeared. They married in September of 1996, and Ree found herself, almost overnight, living the life of a full-time ranch wife, miles from the nearest grocery store, adjusting to a schedule built around cattle instead of casebooks. That culture shock is what eventually produced the Pioneer Woman. Ree started blogging about her daily life on the ranch in 2006, largely as a way to process the adjustment and stay connected to a world outside the isolation of rural Osage County. In the early days, to protect her family's privacy, she avoided using Ladd's real name, instead referring to him as her Marlboro Man, a nickname a friend had jokingly used to describe him. The blog's popularity eventually led to a Food Network deal, and the Pioneer Woman television show launched in 2011, bringing Ladd along with it, somewhat reluctantly by his own account, from a life of total privacy into a recurring role on national television. Audiences responded to him precisely because he wasn't performing. He came across as steady, quiet, and genuinely supportive of his wife's growing career, which turned out to be its own kind of appeal on a network otherwise full of louder personalities. The family that's grown out of that marriage is now a fairly public part of the brand. Ladd and Ree have 5 children: Alex, Paige, Bryce, Todd, and their foster son Jamar, who joined the family in 2018. None of them grew up with an easy ride, at least not in the way people might assume. By numerous accounts from the show and from interviews, the kids were expected to do real ranch work from a young age, up before dawn to help with hay, fencing, and cattle, regardless of how famous their mother's blog or television show became. Alex, the oldest, went to Texas A&M, built a career in Dallas, and married Mauricio Scott in a large wedding on the ranch in May of 2021, just weeks after her father's accident. She and Mauricio welcomed a daughter, Sophia Marie, in December of 2024, making Ladd and Ree grandparents for the first time, and Alex announced in early 2026 that she's expecting a second child later in the year. Paige, the second daughter, took a path that reportedly meant a lot to her father. After graduating from the University of Arkansas and briefly working a corporate job in Dallas, she chose to move back to Pawhuska full-time to work the ranch directly alongside Ladd, becoming, by most accounts, his primary partner in the day-to-day cattle operation. She married David Anderson in May of 2025. The Drummond sons, Bryce and Todd, along with Jamar, grew up playing football in Oklahoma, occasionally featured on the show, with Todd currently playing college football while reportedly keeping the door open to a future back on the ranch if that path doesn't lead where he wants it to. Step back from all of it, the fires, the land, the football games, the weddings, and what you're left with is a fairly consistent picture of a man who has spent his entire life absorbed in physical work most of us will never understand the scale of. That's really the context that explains the accident in the first place. A wildfire on 433,000 acres isn't an abstract inconvenience. It's a direct threat to a herd of thousands of animals, to the land itself, and to the livelihoods of everyone who works it. It's also the reason a man with 2 fractured vertebrae in his neck could be back on a horse within a matter of weeks, because sitting still has never really been part of how this family operates. So if a headline crosses your feed suggesting things aren't looking good for Ladd Drummond, it's worth knowing where that story actually comes from. It's a real, serious accident from March of 2021, one that could have ended very differently than it did, followed by a recovery that, by every public update Ree has given since, has been about as complete as anyone could hope for. The scarier the headline, the more it's worth checking where it's actually coming from. And in this case, the real story is less about an ongoing crisis and more about a genuinely rough couple of months that this family got through years ago. If you want more stories that separate what's actually true from what's just a scary headline, stick around and subscribe.